I'm Stuart Molina. Welcome to the final Conversation with the Maestro of 2021. We're heading into the holiday season, and shortly after New Year's, we'll be having our first Masterworks concert of 2022. And on that concert, we'll be featuring our principal flute player, David DiGiacobbe, in a beautiful concerto for flute by composer Kevin Putz. And so I thought it would be wonderful to feature David today, and he can talk about the flute, talk about his musical journey, and talk a little bit about playing the flute in the Harrisburg Symphony Orchestra. So let's go right to David.
Hey, David, how are you doing?
Hi, Stuart. Great to be
Thanks
here.
so much for joining us today. Let's get started by talking about how you came to the flute. Where did you grow up, and what brought you to this wonderful instrument?
Well, I grew up outside of Philadelphia in the suburbs, actually my first experience with classical music, strangely enough, was at church. I was in third grade, I believe, and the cardinal was coming to our church, so they hired a professional organist, and that was the first time I ever heard Bach's music. And
Wow.
it really made a huge impression on me. I mean, the sound of the organ, the building shaking, all this kind of, as a third grader, really influenced me. And I told my mom, I'm like, I like Bach. I know there's something about this I really enjoy.
Were your parents musical?
No, actually not. My parents were not musical. And I grew up in a big, Italian-American family with football players and, and hockey players. So this was kind of new to them. But they got me organ lessons and piano lessons. So I studied piano and organ for a good 6 years.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was my beginnings in music. And then around 7th grade, we started a band program at our school. And I went through several instruments, trumpet, tuba, believe it or not. And then I finally settled on flute because I wanted to be...
Oh, I'm sorry, I have to ask, was it a reaction to having to carry around a tuba?
Well, that was part of it, yeah. Right. And Bach didn't write too much tuba music, so I really wanted to play where I could still play Bach, play in an orchestra, and still, so the flute was that instrument for me. And luckily enough, I had a wonderful band director, and he really saw my excitement about music and told me right at the front, he's like, you should really study with a professional musician. And he got me involved in a music school in Philadelphia called the Settlement Music School. And it's a school in Philly, which is for high school students, basically. And there I started really my training. I had a really great flute teacher, John Krell, who was the former piccolo player of the Philadelphia Orchestra. So
Oh, how cool.
He really was great with me, and he studied with William Kincaid, who was one of the famous flute players of the Philadelphia Orchestra, and taught me all his little secrets and ideas of flute performance.
So was it love at first sight in terms of the flute? I mean, you had tried all these other instruments. Clearly they weren't resonating with you. When you played the flute, was it like, oh, I'm here, I've arrived? Or was it an evolution while you were learning?
No, I think I knew right away, like this was the instrument for me. And again, for me, I was looking at the practical side of it too. Like, I want to be able to play Bach. I want to be able to play orchestra music. I wanted to play in band, and I wanted something I could carry easily.
Yeah.
So
Can't beat the flute.
But I love the highs and lows of the orchestra. So I was always attracted to those instruments. So.
And at this age, were you attending Philadelphia Orchestra concerts? Had you exposed yourself yet to the orchestral repertoire?
Yes, actually, luckily through Settlement Music School with my teacher John Krell, he also taught at the Curtis Institute of Music, which is a famous music school, of course, in Philadelphia. And he really kind of suggested, why don't you go listen to these rehearsals over at the Curtis Institute? So I would sit in and listen to these rehearsals, and that really influenced me as a 15-year-old to hear rehearsals of the Curtis Institute Orchestra and things like that. And at the same time on TV, I was watching things like the Live from Lincoln Center broadcast. And
I remember them well.
Yeah, I mean, that made a huge impression on me as a 15-year-old to see, the New York Philharmonic on TV or the Metropolitan Opera. So all of this brewing together just got me so excited about music and practicing.
So when did you make the decision that this was going to not just be something you love, but something that you are going to do as a vocation for the rest of your life?
I think I probably knew around 14 or 15.
Wow, that early.
Oh yeah, I mean, just the sound of a live symphony orchestra was so thrilling to me, and that's all I wanted to do. It was a tremendous thing for me to hear something.
Okay, so where did it go from there? After you graduated from high school, I assume you went to conservatory, and where did you do that? And how did you choose where you would study?
Well, let's see. So in high school, I went through the youth orchestras. I played in the Delaware County Youth Orchestra, which was my first experience in orchestra, and that was really wonderful. And from there, I moved on to the Philadelphia Youth Orchestra.
I know it well.
Yes, you know it well. That was really important to me. And then I had to decide where to go to school. And at that time, there were several places. I ended up at Temple University, which had a wonderful program where you could pick the teacher you wanted to study with. And that was quite important to me. And so I ended up going to Temple and studying with Renee Siebert, who was the second flute of the New York Philharmonic. Now, my goal was to study with Julius Baker, who was one of the most famous flute players of the time, of course.
Yep.
And however, I wasn't ready for him. So
So did you commute to New York to take your lessons?
Yes, and that in college was an amazing thing. And because here I was studying at Temple in Philadelphia, but I would take the train up to New York on Fridays and have my lesson with Renee. And then she would allow me to sit in on the rehearsals, that was
awesome.
going on that day. So that, watching the New York Philharmonic rehearse was really, really interesting. Especially, I remember in one case, Leonard Bernstein was conducting the Mahler Second, and I thought, wow,
I remember that performance. It was one of the great performances of my life.
And I just, so Renee was wonderful that way. She understood my passion, for flute and orchestral performance, and she's like, "You're going to come sit in on this." She knew, just like John Krell in high school knew, you better come and listen to this and be experience this live. So
it's such an amazing thing to have mentorship like that. It really can put your life in a different direction from anything that would have been possible otherwise. How lucky are you that you had these two wonderful guides that early in your life?
It was wonderful. I mean, they both were wonderful, and just to be able to go to New York and then even on a Saturday go hear the Philadelphia Orchestra, that was my life. Working hard and going to live performances.
Well, I have to take a digression and bring up that this was when we first crossed paths. Do you want to talk a little bit about your experiences playing outside of Temple?
Sure. Well, by my senior year, I started freelancing a bit in Philadelphia. I was taking auditions and doing well and making finals and things like this. And I got to work with the opera company a little bit, playing backstage and things like this. But one job that came up was there was an opening at Curtis for a flutist because one of the regular four flutes there came down with tendonitis. So they needed a flute player. And I'm like, I'm your man. So I did get to play at Curtis quite a bit my senior year, and especially for the conducting class of Otto Werner Mueller. And I remember that's where I met you for the
That's
first
right.
time. You were conducting that year. I guess that was your graduating program or something.
Yeah, I think it was my final program at Romeo and Juliet, I think. Or was that it? Or
right.
Appalachian Spring. It was quite a time. But so Philadelphia actually is a very rich market for freelancing, isn't it?
Yes, especially. At least at that time it was. But it did get my feet wet with freelancing and playing with the ballet and the opera, and it's a great city. I mean,
so where did it go from there? You graduate from Temple, you're out in the real world and trying to make a living. Did you stay in Philadelphia? I'm assuming that you basically stayed there through now.
Well, I was freelancing, but I was itching to continue my studies. I was doing a lot of auditions, which was fine, but I felt like my education wasn't finished. So I was looking actually to go to Europe to just do some graduate work. So I ended up moving to Italy, to Lucca, where they have a fantastic conservatory and
Oh, and what a beautiful city.
beautiful city. And the flute teacher there was just fabulous. And I wanted to work with him because I wanted to broaden my education. I wanted to study baroque flute and I wanted to study contemporary music. And I just felt I needed to be a little more well-rounded, you know, to just get a lot more done in my music.
I'm going to stop you for a moment because you mentioned baroque flute. I'm sure some of our viewers have no idea what the difference is. Is it an actually different instrument, or is it just a different way of playing the flute that you normally play?
Well, a bit of both. It is actually a different instrument. It's a wood instrument that only has one key. And this would be the flute that Bach wrote for, and Handel and Telemann. And at that time in Europe, it was very important for players to learn even their early instruments. So the Baroque flute was part of the course. I had to learn a new key system, or new fingering system, I should say, and learn the nuances of Baroque style. And that was really important to me to understand nuancing in the Baroque style. So yeah, so the Baroque flute was, I only got to a certain level, but it was really important because when I went back to my modern flute, things started making more sense. So,
Well, and as a lover of Bach, it was only a natural thing for you to at least dabble in baroque flute.
yeah.
That's really cool. So how long were you in Italy?
So I was in Italy for 2 years, so I did my graduate work there, and even my last year there, I started freelancing a little bit, but then I knew it was time to go back home. The romantic idea of moving to Italy and getting a job in an orchestra there, I started realizing there was something about the American orchestra that I really wanted to be part of. So I did come back. And then I started auditioning, and luckily that's when jobs started happening for me. And that was
So what was your first job? What was the first audition that you won?
Oh wow! So the first audition I won, strangely enough, was a job in Argentina.
Wow.
So yes, and however, I didn't take it. At the time, the difference in the dollar was really not very good. So I could get down there, but I may not be able to get back. So even though it was a very interesting idea, I did not take that job. I stayed in Philadelphia. I continued freelancing, but I continued taking auditions, and I was playing in small orchestras and with the ballet orchestra, for example. And then the job for Harrisburg came up very shortly after that. So, and luckily, I won the job in Harrisburg.
Yeah, lucky for all of us, I would say. That's fantastic. But you play regularly with other orchestras as well. I know that you play with the ballet in Philadelphia. Was that an audition as well that you had to win?
Yes. Well, the audition for the ballet actually wasn't an audition for the ballet. I actually auditioned for the opera company. But basically, it's a lot of the same members. They kind of crisscross the ballet and the opera. So after I was runner-up for the job at the opera, and I think because of that, I was kind of taken, quote, seriously as a player in Philadelphia. So that helped my job situation in Philly. So
Fantastic. Well, this is probably a good time to take a small break and listen to the musical offering that you've brought for us. Do you want to introduce what everyone's going to hear now?
Sure, yeah. So this piece I'm going to play for you is by Eugene Bozza. And Bozza is a French composer of the 20th century. I believe this piece was written around 1932, 33. But it's a beautiful piece. It's for solo flute, and it really shows the qualities of the flute. And the French composers are very good at this, as far as color and timbre. And
I was going to ask you about that because if people say, what nationality of composition do you associate with the flute, it would immediately be the French. Why do you think this is? Why do the French understand this instrument and what it's capable of so much better than other nationalities?
I think simply because of the fact that around 1840, a new key system was developed, and the French professors at the conservatory adapted this flute. And once this new key system was available, we suddenly were able to play chromatic scales and much more difficult music. And that's why the French composers, Saint-Saëns, Taffanel, Gounod, all these composers, Ibert, started writing very difficult music for the flute because we could do it suddenly. So whereas the Germans, we don't have any concertos by Beethoven, Brahms, because the instrument simply couldn't manage.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, so the French really took that on. And this Botza is a perfect example. It takes you through the whole register of the flute. There's even some special effects like flutter tonguing, where you roll your R, but it's a very impressionistic piece, and I think very just the right kind of piece for someone to listen to.
Well, wonderful. Let's give it a hear. Well, I mean, this is the second time I've heard you play this piece, and extremely beautiful playing of an extremely beautiful piece. What I love about watching you play, and actually it seems a lot of flute players as well, is it isn't just, there's nothing stiff about it at all. You're a very organic player. It feels like your whole body is moving with the music. Is that something you learn, or is that just an outpouring of your natural love of the music?
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think the flute, it's one of the oldest instruments in civilization. I mean, it goes back to Asian instruments and things like this. So I think there's something very natural, especially playing the flute, the use of the air. There's something, it's an extension of the breath, so to speak. So that's probably one of the reasons why I took it up. It's in my opinion, one of the instruments that it's closest to the voice. In its use of air and vibrato, which is the sound of the note moving. So there's expressive components to the instrument that I connect with. So
let's talk about vibrato for a moment, because you brought that up. It's something we've never discussed in this Conversations with the Maestro, and it's something that I think is so important for pretty much every instrument, and it's something that we don't really think about. When you're talking about vibrato and these little fluctuations of breath, I'm assuming that this is something you have to work very, very hard on to control. Do you actually change the occurrence of the vibrato, like how fast it is or how slow it is, intentionally as you're playing? Is that part of your preparation when you're preparing music?
Yes, yeah, very much so. I think about that a lot, especially depending on the repertoire we're playing, whether it's Brahms or Ravel or Stravinsky. The vibrato is really the personality, in my opinion, of a player. So I think about this a lot, depending where the music is going, harmonically, things like this. But vibrato has always been a beautiful thing to talk about for flute players. We talk about it all the time. So
when you're geeking out as a flute player.
That's right. And one of my teachers, Julius Baker, had the most beautiful vibrato, and it would just stop you in your tracks. It was just so gorgeous. So I remember talking to him in detail about things like that, and it really can change a person's response to what's happening in the music. So so I do think about it quite a bit, and we do work on it. We work on different lengths and amplitudes and things like that, so that when we come to the music making, it's organic and it's natural, and it brings something new.
That's fascinating. And what are some of the other quirks of the flute that our watching audience may not know about? What are the things that either you love particularly about the flute, or that you find particularly difficult about the flute?
Right. Well, difficult things with the flute, I would say the intonation of the flute can be very tricky.
Why don't you briefly explain what intonation means?
So intonation is the pitch level that you need to maintain with your colleagues. And that's something that we are always being very careful that, since the flute is at the top of the orchestra, it's very important that our pitch and our intonation is exact, and that we're always listening to everyone around us, including the violin section. Oftentimes I'm blending with the trumpets or the horns, and oftentimes we're always playing inside their sound. So that's probably one of the most difficult things, is to develop a sense of good intonation so that you're always blending beautifully with your colleagues. And that's something that I enjoy, especially in Harrisburg.
Well, when you're playing an orchestra, and you brought out that you're the top voice, you're always audible. I mean, you may be playing within the trumpet sound, but you can always hear the flute because it's at the top. Is that something that makes you nervous? Does that add an extra stress level to your playing, or is that like, this is awesome, I'm always being heard?
Yeah, well, a bit of both. I mean, it's very exciting to kind of ride on the top of that lush sound of an orchestra, but it's a huge responsibility too. I mean, I love the feeling of it, but it brings with it a huge responsibility. That what you're doing is musical, and yeah, it's a fantastic feeling. But One reason probably I played the flute too. You know,
Yeah.
it's just lovely, and the ability to mix and blend with all these instruments, and it's a lot of fun.
Well, I think this is as good a segue as any to talk about what's coming up in January for you. You're actually someone who gets to play concertos with some frequency, which is, I think, fantastic. And this will be your second concerto of this season because you just played Mozart in Lancaster. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And so the question that I have, well, first of all, let's talk about the concerto that you'll be playing. What is it that you love about this piece? And what is the shift that you have to make from playing within an orchestra to playing in front of an orchestra?
Right. Well, one shift that you do have to create is a issue of volume too, because when you're out front, you do really need to think about your ability to project, and that's very important. So that's heightened a little bit. So there is more responsibility there for the soloist, and also that you have an understanding of the whole. You know, not that just you're a soloist, but that this is a composition that includes the orchestra, and so that's a very exciting thing about playing as a soloist. And I'm thrilled. I mean, like you said, I did play the Mozart Concerto just a month ago in Lancaster, where I'm also the principal flutist, and that was a really wonderful experience because Mozart's Concerto in G is one of the great concertos that we all have to play, and I haven't played it in a really long time. That was a very exciting experience. However, the concerto I'm doing in January, the Kevin Putz concerto, is a fabulous piece, and I'm very excited to play it with Harrisburg Symphony.
It's a few years overdue as well. I mean, this was going to be on the very next concert that was canceled that weekend. We were ready to play it. Oh my gracious. So back in March 2020, and now here we are a year and 3/4 later. So talk about this piece a little bit. It was a piece that I had never heard before. In fact, I mean, I knew Kevin Putz's music, but I didn't know that he had written a flute concerto, and you said you need to listen to this, and it was really, I fell in love with it immediately. It's so gorgeous, but what appeals to you particularly about this piece?
Well, I've played Kevin's music before because we've done some of his symphonies in Harrisburg,
Yep.
so I do remember liking his music very much. However, I have an interesting story. I was driving to a family party. It was Christmas Day, and it was a beautiful snow. You know, there was snow on the ground. Driving, and there was music on the radio. It was music for chorus, a cappella chorus, and it just stopped me in my tracks. It was so beautiful that I had to pull over and wait and find out who wrote this music. And it was music by Kevin Putz. It was his piece, "If I Were a Swan."
Oh,
And
wow.
it just affected me so much. Like, what beautiful writing. So I said, I need to look into this composer more. When I got back home, I noticed he did write a flute concerto only a few years earlier. So I said, all right, I need to look into this. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I mean, it's very American. It's very wholesome. It's very warm, and he uses the orchestra brilliantly with the soloist. So
He really does. What I found kind of astonishing about the piece is, first of all, how it begins. It just begins, kind of sucks you into this pastoral, beautiful world. Very lyrical, very, very tonal. And also the way that it ends, because it ends in a way that I've never experienced a piece before, where the entire orchestra, other than the flute, is clapping rhythms. And so everyone is now a percussion player, except the flute is playing, dazzling things on top of it. I'm so excited to actually hear how it comes together, and I'm very excited to bring it to our audience. So I thank you for bringing it to me. Is there anything else you want to say about this concerto or the experience of playing concertos with our orchestra?
only that it's been a highlight of my life. I mean, I remember playing the Lieberman Concerto back in, was it 2005, and that was really one of my...
Another really beautiful piece, kind of cut out of the same cloth.
Yes, right. I mean, just brilliant, and just to play with this orchestra that is so dear to my heart, and you at the podium. I mean,
Well, thanks.
I'm very excited.
What is the shift like when you're playing within an orchestra, and then not just playing a concerto, but playing a concerto with that orchestra as your colleagues? I mean, as your collaborators. Is that something that's different, let's say, than if you were invited to play with an orchestra that you didn't play in?
Yeah, I mean, your expectations are a little bit higher, perhaps, because you don't want to let your colleagues down. And I have so much respect for my colleagues. I just want to do my very best. So my prep work, everything about it is just on another level. So yeah, but it's such a joy also to play with your colleagues and your friends, knowing that you've played through so much repertoire, and then you get to do this one concerto. So it's thrilling.
Well, I think it works in both directions, because I think the orchestra also comes with their like A-plus game. This orchestra always brings their A game, but there's something just a little bit more like, we want to do it for David, because he plays with us, and I think that you're generally very well liked by the orchestra, liked and respected.
That's sweet. Thank you.
So before we finish, I do want to talk about one other thing, and we generally do, and that's to talk about the experience of the Harrisburg Symphony. You've now been playing with the orchestra for over 20 years. Certainly since I've been here, you've been a fixture in the orchestra. First, what makes the orchestra special? And then, what changes have you seen over the course of your time here? How is the orchestra developing and changing?
Well, first of all, I think it's the product we produce, which is very exciting. And we can feel that when we play live. I mean, that's why I'm so glad we're back to live performances.
Yeah.
Because you feel it from the audience. You feel the work we've done, and the music making come from the audience. The appreciation is very unique in Harrisburg. So I have to say that is a unique experience to start with. And I think as far as, I have played for more than 20 years in the orchestra, just to see the level increase and increase. I mean, it's no secret that the Harrisburg Symphony is one of the really great regional orchestras. I mean, everybody wants to play here,
Yep.
Everybody wants to be a sub, So I think it comes down to the music making, the quality of the music, the expertise in the sections, and also the camaraderie between the players. I mean, that's something that's very unique, I think, to this orchestra, and which you don't always see in other orchestras.
What do you attribute that to? Why do you think there's this particular sense of camaraderie and friendship in this orchestra?
I think about it all the time. I can't put my finger on it. I think it's just that we have such a mutual respect for each other. Plus, coming together as a group for 4 or 5 days, that kind of helps too, because we're all together and we go out. We eat together, we have a drink together, and that all brings it together. And I think that's the one thing that might be lacking in some of these larger orchestras where people just go home.
I think it's true. I mean, I remember when I was involved in theater, it was the same kind of thing. When the company was on the road, it was a happier, more cohesive group. As soon as you get back to New York and everyone's going to their apartments rather than to the same hotel, it just changes the dynamic. So that's very interesting. That's and lastly, we're coming out of a crisis time, obviously, and I trust you got through it okay. It was a little bit tricky, but I think that we've emerged somewhat. What do you see as the future of our art form? A lot of people are worried about this now. Do you think the audiences are going to return at the levels they were at before? And do you think that we'll be able to draw in new audiences with this enforced break, basically, in the continuum?
Yeah, well, I think the pandemic was really tricky for all of us. It's interesting. I don't have any fear that the art form is going to go anywhere, because I remember when I was, 17, 18, people go, well, you should, get away from orchestras. That art form's dying. But I haven't seen that yet, honestly. If anything, I see people more interested in live music. And I think that's contributed to, people being interested in music in the movies and scores, from movie soundtracks and things like that. There's still a real strong interest, I think, in orchestral music.
Yeah.
So even though there's fear that, oh wow, maybe this art form is dying, I have to be honest, I don't see it personally. all the institutions I play with, the ballet, the opera, they're all coming back slowly, but they're coming back, and people are buying tickets. Broadway's back.
Yep.
People are buying tickets. Chamber music is happening more and more. So I'm excited for the future. And a lot of times when something terrible like this happens, yes, some orchestras may possibly die away, but I think there's also room now for new groups to be forming, and I see that happening too. So.
Well, I definitely like that optimistic outlook. I subscribe to that as well. Listen, David, it's always such a joy to talk to you. We've been working together for many, many years, and it's a joy to have you in the orchestra and to speak to you today. Thanks so much for sharing with us, and very much looking forward to your concerto, which, by the way, for those of you watching, is on January 8th and 9th at the Scottish Rite Auditorium, Kevin Putz's Flute Concerto, and it will also be sharing a program with Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony, which is in itself a wonderful piece, and the Vaughan Williams Fantasia on a theme by Thomas Tallis. So be there and watch this wonderful artist make music with us. Thanks so much, David. I'll see you very soon.
Thank you, Stuart. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much to David for that wonderful interview and for the beautiful music. Again, on January 8th and 9th, at the Scottish Rite Auditorium, we'll be having our January Masterworks. The program begins with music of Vaughan Williams, the Fantasia, on a theme by Thomas Tallis. This will be followed by the concerto that David will be playing by Kevin Putz, his Flute Concerto. And then finally, a beautiful symphony by Felix Mendelssohn, the Scottish Symphony, number 3. Please be there. It should be a wonderful performance. And in the meantime, I'll take this opportunity to wish, on behalf of the entire Harrisburg Symphony Association and Orchestra, a very, very happy holiday season to every one of you. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the new year.